3 days after my husband's funeral, I walked up to the front entrance of the art center. It was my first morning back after Thomas's funeral. Everything looked exactly as I had left it, and the building I had spent 8 years restoring stood just 20 feet away. I reached into my purse, pulled out my access card, and tapped it against the reader. The light should have turned green. Instead, it blinked red, and the lock stayed shut. I tried again, then one more time. Nothing. For a moment, I just stood there in the cold morning air, staring at the glass doors. That art center had been my life. When I bought it, the roof leaked, the floors sagged, and half the town called it a lost cause. My husband, Thomas, had believed in me from the beginning. He was the one who brought me coffee at midnight and held the flashlight while I climbed ladders. Now, Thomas was gone, and the card in my hand had just been rejected by the only place I had ever truly built. The side door opened behind me. I turned and saw Ryan, Thomas's younger brother, walking toward me with a folder under his arm. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the reader, then at me. "Claire," he said softly, "I should have called. Why doesn't my card work?" He hesitated just long enough for me to feel the answer. The locks were changed yesterday by the estate's attorney. Until probate is settled, the center is being treated as part of Thomas's assets. I stared at him. That's impossible. I bought this building. I restored it. Thomas never owned it. Ryan's expression didn't change. "I know what you believe, but the paperwork says something different." And in that moment, I understood something I had never wanted to believe. Someone had not only locked me out, they had rewritten my life while I was still standing in front of it. I looked back at the building, the windows I had replaced, the stone steps I had repaired, the lobby where I had spent so many nights covered in dust and paint. Every inch of it carried my work, my money, and my name. And now, according to a folder in Ryan's hand, none of that seemed to matter. "Let me see the papers," I said. Ryan opened the folder and handed me the first page. My eyes scanned the lines. There it was, in black and white, a temporary estate claim, a freeze on access, and a note saying all decisions regarding the property would be handled through Thomas's family. Thomas's family, as if I was not standing right there. My hands started to shake. Thomas never told me any of this. Ryan lowered his voice. "There are things you don't know yet." I wanted to demand answers right there on the front steps, but before I could speak, I heard footsteps inside the building, then the faint sound of voices moving through the lobby. People were in there. My staff, my volunteers, the students who came every week, and I was standing outside like a stranger. Ryan followed my gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, though his voice sounded more like a warning. "You should probably go home." Go home? As if this wasn't my home? As if I had not just buried my husband 3 days ago? I folded the papers slowly and handed them back. Then I looked at the locked door one more time. The glass reflected my face back at me, pale and stunned, and suddenly very alone. That was the moment I realized this was not a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a fight, and I had no idea yet how deep the betrayal really went. If you had met me as a little girl, you never would have guessed that one day I'd spend my life bringing forgotten buildings back to life. My father, Daniel Bennett, wasn't a famous architect or a wealthy man. He spent his career restoring old buildings that most people drove past without noticing. To everyone else, they were just old structures. To him, they were stories waiting to be remembered. Some of my earliest memories are of holding a flashlight while he worked. I couldn't have been older than 7 when he first let me follow him into an abandoned one-room schoolhouse outside our town. The roof leaked, the windows were cracked, and dust covered everything. I remember asking him why anyone would spend money fixing a place that looked ready to collapse. He smiled without stopping his work and said, "Claire, people think we're repairing wood and bricks. We're really protecting memories." At that age, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but every weekend he took me somewhere different, and eventually I began to notice something. Every building had fingerprints left behind by the people who loved it. Sometimes it was a child's name carved beneath a windowsill, or handwritten notes hidden behind wallpaper by workers decades earlier. My father never rushed those discoveries. He always stopped, held them carefully, and told me, "This is why we don't erase the past just because it's inconvenient." People often assume I learned construction from my father. That's true. He taught me how to recognize water damage before anyone else could see it, and why a strong foundation matters more than beautiful paint. But the greatest lesson he ever gave me had nothing to do with construction. He taught me that a building only has value because of the lives it protects. Without people, it's just stone. That belief shaped every decision I made as an adult. After college, while many of my classmates accepted comfortable jobs with large architecture firms, I took a different path. Most people thought I was making a mistake. Historic restoration wasn't glamorous or profitable, but I couldn't imagine doing anything else. When I was 32, I finally took the biggest risk of my life and started my own restoration company. It started in a tiny rented room above a hardware store with just one part-time employee, but slowly, project by project, people began trusting my work. Then I heard about an abandoned estate sitting on the edge of town. Most developers wanted to demolish it, but the first time I walked through its empty, decaying halls, I saw possibilities. Against nearly everyone's advice, I bought the property. Friends, bankers, and contractors all told me I was making a huge mistake. But I wasn't buying a building, I was protecting a future. Restoring that estate became the largest project my company had ever attempted. Every day brought another unexpected problem, from rotting beams to budget overruns. There were nights I drove home wondering whether I had destroyed everything I had spent years building. Then, during one of the early community meetings, I met Thomas Walker. Thomas was the director of our local history museum. He believed in preserving local history just as much as I did, and he had a gift I never possessed. He could inspire people. Where I spoke about engineering, Thomas spoke about community. He convinced local businesses to donate and persuaded volunteers to help clean the property. Little by little, the town stopped seeing the estate as my impossible dream, and it became something everyone wanted to save. At first, Thomas and I talked only about the project. Then we started having coffee after meetings, and soon those conversations lasted longer than the meetings themselves. Neither of us planned for friendship to become love. It simply happened while we were trying to build something that mattered. Looking back now, sometimes I wonder whether the restoration project changed my life because it saved an old building or because it introduced me to the man I believed would become my safest place. At the time, I thought those two stories would always belong together. I had no idea that one day, the very place that brought us together would become the center of the greatest betrayal I would ever face. Looking back now, I realize the warning signs were never hidden. They were right in front of me. The problem wasn't that I couldn't see them. The problem was that I kept finding reasons to excuse them. By the time the Arts Center became the heart of our town, people no longer remembered what the property looked like before the restoration. They saw concerts on Friday nights, children taking painting classes, and artists filling the galleries. The building had become a place where people belonged. That was exactly what I had hoped for when I bought the abandoned estate. What I didn't expect was how quickly people began attaching someone else's name to it. Ryan Walker, Thomas's son from his first marriage, had never shown much interest in the restoration itself. He was several years younger than me, chasing one failed business idea after another. He wasn't cruel when I first met him. He was charming, confident, and carried a dangerous belief that being born Walker meant success owed him something. At first, I thought he was simply immature. I never imagined that belief would destroy everything. Whenever Ryan visited the Arts Center, he loved giving visitors tours. More than once, I overheard him downstairs speaking to guests. "My dad built this place," he'd say. The first time I heard it, I almost laughed. Thomas had organized fundraisers and introduced me to donors, but he hadn't restored the building. I let the comment go. As months turned into years, the story became bolder. My father created this art center. Sometimes Ryan said it while standing right beside photographs showing me supervising construction crews. I would hear those words from across the room, pause for a moment, then smile politely and continue working. I told myself the truth didn't need defending. I believed that facts spoke for themselves. I couldn't have been more wrong. One evening, I finally mentioned it to Thomas. I noticed Ryan likes telling people you built the center. Thomas smiled in that calm, reassuring way of his. He gets excited, he said. He knows how much this place means to me. It sounded reasonable enough, but it wasn't really an answer. A few weeks later, it happened again. Ryan was speaking with a local newspaper reporter. I stood only 20 feet away and heard him say, "My father devoted years to building this place for the community." The reporter smiled and wrote it down. I almost walked over to explain that I had purchased the estate, that my company had restored every room. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was. I convinced myself it wasn't important. The article appeared the following Sunday. Thomas was featured on the front page, Ryan was quoted twice, and my name appeared once near the bottom, identifying me simply as a restoration consultant. I laughed when I read it, because admitting how much it hurt felt childish. Thomas noticed the article later that evening. "I should probably ask them to correct that," he said. I smiled and replied, "It's fine." Those two words became my biggest mistake. Every time Ryan exaggerated another story, every time someone congratulated Thomas for my work, I told myself, it's fine. Except it wasn't. Every sentence left unchallenged became another brick in a story that never belonged to them. The strange thing about repetition is that people stop asking whether something is true. If they hear it often enough, they simply accept it. The lies spread until almost everyone believed it. Neighbors, business owners, and volunteers, nobody was lying on purpose anymore. They were simply repeating what they had always heard. And because I had never corrected anyone, my silence became part of the lie. Sometimes people ask me when everything truly started falling apart. They assume it began after Thomas passed away. They're wrong. It began years earlier. Every single time I chose peace over truth. Silence has a cost. If a lie is repeated long enough without being challenged, it starts sounding like history. By the time I finally realized that, history had already been rewritten, and I was about to pay the price for letting someone else write it. 3 days after Thomas's funeral, I stood outside the art center I had spent 8 years restoring, holding an envelope that told me I no longer belonged there. I drove home without turning on the radio and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the letter for nearly an hour before I finally opened it. It was from a law office I had never heard of, stating that Ryan Walker had instructed management to suspend my access until ownership questions were resolved. The wording was careful. It never actually claimed Ryan owned the art center. It just implied that my authority over it was now uncertain. At first, I thought there had to be a mistake. I owned the property. I had purchased the estate years before I ever married Thomas, and my company had paid for every phase of the restoration. Why would an attorney suggest I had no right to enter my own building? I needed answers. The next morning, I called an attorney named Margaret Ellis. She specialized in estate law and commercial property disputes. When I arrived at her office, I carried 2 boxes filled with property records, restoration contracts, and financial statements. Margaret looked at the boxes and smiled gently. "I've learned something over the years," she said. "People who bring documentation instead of accusations usually have the stronger case." She spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the papers before asking, Has anyone actually told you they believe Ryan owns the property? No, I answered. They've only locked me out. Margaret nodded slowly. That's an important difference. Then she turned her computer screen toward me. There it is. A legal filing had been submitted only 1 day after Thomas's funeral. Ryan had petitioned the probate court to treat the art center as a potential asset connected to his father's estate. Margaret looked directly at me. This filing does not mean he owns your property, Claire. It doesn't even mean he's likely to win. So why does it matter? I asked. Because uncertainty has consequences. She explained that while the filing didn't give Ryan ownership, it froze everything connected to the property. It created a cloud over the center's legal status. Banks, insurance companies, and major donors would all hesitate the moment they saw an ownership dispute. I suddenly remembered our expansion project. Just 2 weeks before Thomas passed away, my company had received preliminary approval for a loan to convert the carriage house into classrooms for local students. It was the largest community project we had ever attempted. Margaret made a quick phone call to the bank, listening more than she spoke. When she hung up, her face told me everything. The loan review has been suspended. They won't move forward while this remains unresolved. I felt something inside me sink. Construction would start before it even started. The skilled craftsmen would move on, and the students we had promised new classrooms would have to wait indefinitely. I looked across Margaret's desk. So I haven't actually lost the property? No, but I can't operate it. Not until we clear this up. The distinction sounded small, but in reality, it changed everything. Ryan hadn't stolen my life's work. Not yet. He had done something far more strategic. He had frozen it. He understood that a community project doesn't survive on ownership papers alone. It survives on momentum, trust, and financial stability. Every week of uncertainty would cost us opportunities that might never return. Margaret closed the folder. I believe the documents are on your side, but legal truth and practical reality are not always the same thing. Driving home, I realized the real battle had nothing to do with whether I could prove the arts center belonged to me. I knew I could. The question was how much damage Ryan could cause before the truth finally caught up with him. I wasn't facing a misunderstanding anymore. I was facing someone who knew exactly how to weaponize doubt. After meeting with Margaret, I drove straight to the art center. Not because I expected Ryan to let me inside. I already knew he wouldn't. I parked across the street instead, and for nearly an hour I watched parents drop off their children for art classes while volunteers carried supplies through the front entrance. Life inside the building continued almost as if nothing had happened, except I was no longer part of it. As I sat there, my phone rang. It was Samuel Brooks, a retired structural engineer who had volunteered beside me during almost every major phase of the restoration. "Claire," he said, "I heard what Ryan did. Let's get coffee." An hour later, we were sitting in a quiet diner. Sam didn't waste time pretending everything would be fine. Instead, he looked at me and asked, "Do you remember the winter the west roof almost collapsed?" Of course I remembered. A heavy snowstorm had arrived weeks early, and the old roof started sagging under the weight. Every contractor told me we had to wait until spring, but waiting meant letting months of restoration work get destroyed. Sam smiled faintly. "I remember getting your call at 2 in the morning. When I arrived, you were already up on that roof in the freezing wind, reinforcing the temporary supports. I've heard people say Thomas built that place, Claire, but I was there. I know who was carrying lumber at 3 in the morning." Hearing someone else say those words out loud reminded me that the truth didn't exist inside my head. The following afternoon, Emily Carter, who managed the library inside the Arts Center, came to my office looking nervous. She held a small cardboard box against her chest. "I found these while organizing storage," she said, placing the box on my desk. Inside were dozens of old photographs of construction, blueprints, and community cleanup days. Emily picked up one photo. "You probably don't even remember this." I looked closer. There I was, covered in dust, standing on scaffolding nearly 30 feet above the ground. Emily smiled. "I took this during my first week. You were the only person still working after everyone else had gone home. I've listened to Ryan tell visitors his father built the center. I never said anything because I assumed everyone already knew the truth." I lowered my eyes. "So did I." "I don't think they do anymore," she quietly answered. Those words hurt because I knew she was right, but the support didn't stop there. My next-door neighbor, Eleanor Hayes, stopped by that week. She had watched the entire restoration from her window for years. "I remember replacing those tiles during that awful summer heat," she told me. "Every evening I'd look outside and your truck would still be parked there after dark. I watched you leave before sunrise and come home after midnight. No one who lived on this street believes someone else built that place." Then a phone call came from David Morales, a local business owner and one of our largest private donors. We met at his office the next morning, where he handed me copies of the original funding agreements. Every single document listed my restoration company as the project owner. David looked directly at me. "Claire, people don't support projects because they're loud. They support them because someone quietly does the work. I watched you earn every dollar I donated, and I'll tell anyone who asks." Driving home that afternoon, something inside me began changing. For days, I had felt isolated, as though Ryan's version of the story had erased my own. But one by one, the people who had actually been there were speaking up. Sam remembered the freezing nights on the roof. Emily remembered the endless evenings in the dust. Eleanor saw my truck parked outside long after dark. And David remembered exactly who carried the project from an impossible dream to reality. The truth had never disappeared. It had simply been drowned out by a louder story, and now the people who witnessed it were finally giving it its voice. A week after I met with Margaret, she called me just before lunch. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the weight behind her words. "Claire, I need you to come to my office. I think we've found the answer to a question you've been asking ever since Thomas passed away." I drove there without turning on the radio. The silence felt easier than trying to guess what she had discovered. When I arrived, Margaret was already waiting with several folders across the conference table. Beside it sat a small, black metal lockbox. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Thomas. He kept it in the study at home, but I had never opened it, because I had trusted him enough to believe I never needed to. Margaret rested one hand on the box. This was listed among Thomas's personal effects. She looked at me carefully. "There was nothing illegal inside, but there were things I believe you deserve to see." She unlocked the lid and slowly lifted the cap. There were no family photographs or sentimental keepsakes, only paperwork, stacks and stacks of loan agreements, bank statements, and transfer confirmations. At first, none of it made any sense. Then Margaret slid one document toward me. "Look at the recipient." The transfer had been made to Ryan. I frowned. "There has to be an explanation." "There is," Margaret replied quietly. She handed me another statement, then another. Different years, different amounts, the same recipient, Ryan Walker. As we sorted through the records, a pattern slowly emerged. Whenever Ryan's businesses failed or creditors threatened legal action, money appeared. Margaret had already organized the transfers into chronological order and turned the final page toward me. The total sat at the bottom, $123,400. I stared at the number for what felt like forever. "I didn't know." "I know," Margaret answered. Every account involved was legally Thomas's: his retirement savings, his private investment account, a personal line of credit. None of the money had come from the Arts Center or my company. Legally, Thomas had every right to spend it. That wasn't what hurt. What hurt was realizing he had carried this burden completely alone for years. Memories began connecting in ways they never had before. The weekends, Thomas suddenly needed to visit old friends. The evenings, he seemed distracted during dinner. He hadn't been hiding another family or gambling. He had been rescuing Ryan, again and again. Finally, I asked the question that mattered most. Why didn't he tell me? Instead of answering, Margaret reached into the lockbox one last time. There was something else. She placed a single envelope in front of me. My name was written across it in Thomas's handwriting. Just Claire. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter was only one page. It didn't begin with an apology. It simply began with the truth. Claire, if you're reading this, it means I've waited too long to have a conversation I should have had years ago. Ryan has spent most of his adult life believing one successful decision would fix every mistake that came before it. Every time he failed, I convinced myself this would be the last time I needed to help him. Every time I was wrong. I could hear Thomas's voice in every sentence. The next paragraph hurt even more. You once asked me why I looked so tired. I told you work had been stressful. That wasn't true. I had just emptied another retirement account to keep Ryan from losing everything. I closed my eyes. That conversation had happened almost 4 years earlier. I remembered touching his shoulder, believing he simply needed more rest. He had smiled at me and lied, because he couldn't bear to admit he had failed both as a father and as a husband. I forced myself to keep reading. I hope one day Claire will understand why I never found the courage to tell the truth. That single sentence broke something inside me. It was written by a frightened father who had confused love with rescue for far too long. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Margaret waited until I looked up. What are you thinking? I answered honestly. I don't know whether to be angry or heartbroken. She nodded. Sometimes both can exist at the same time. Driving home that evening, I wasn't thinking about Ryan. For the first time since all of this had started, I was thinking only about Thomas. I still loved the man I had married, but love doesn't erase disappointment. As I pulled into my driveway, I realized something else. Ryan hadn't invented the illusion that everything his father touched would eventually become his. Someone had quietly protected that illusion for years through silence. And silence, no matter how well-intentioned, always sends someone else the bill. Now, Thomas was gone. The silence was over, and I was the one left to face everything it had created. By the time the preliminary hearing arrived, I had stopped hoping for quick justice. Margaret had warned me what these hearings were designed to do. This isn't the final trial, she reminded me as we walked into the courthouse. It's about determining whether Ryan has any legitimate basis for tying the art center to Thomas's estate. I nodded. For weeks, I had imagined dramatic courtroom confrontations, but everything felt surprisingly ordinary. No television cameras, no crowded gallery, just a judge, 2 attorneys, Ryan, Margaret, and me. Ryan arrived with his attorney looking confident. Not arrogant, not angry, just confident. For the first time in weeks, I wondered whether he truly believed everything he'd been saying. Maybe he had repeated the same story for so many years that he honestly believed it himself. That thought didn't excuse what he had done, but it made the situation far more tragic. The judge entered the courtroom and everyone stood. After a few procedural matters, Ryan's attorney argued that because Thomas had devoted years to the art center, questions remained about whether it should temporarily be considered part of the estate. The attorney spoke calmly, never claiming Ryan had personally restored the property, simply suggesting there were unresolved questions. Then it was Margaret's turn. She didn't raise her voice or attack Ryan. Instead, she walked toward the center of the courtroom carrying a thin folder. She stopped a few feet from Ryan and asked her first question. Mr. Walker, do you have the original architectural drawings for the restoration project? Ryan looked briefly at his attorney. No. Margaret nodded politely. Do you have the construction contracts used to restore the estate? No. Do you possess the engineering reports prepared before construction began? No. She continued in exactly the same calm tone, asking about the invoices, the roofing contracts, the city permits, and the contractor payment records. To every single question, Ryan shook his head. No. Every answer sounded exactly the same. Short, simple, and empty. Margaret paused for only a moment, then asked one final question. Mr. Walker, have you personally seen any of those documents before today? Ryan hesitated longer this time. Finally, he answered, no. The courtroom became remarkably quiet. The silence itself became part of the testimony. Margaret thanked him and returned to our table, then looked at me. Claire? I stood, feeling every pair of eyes in the courtroom turn toward me. Margaret smiled reassuringly. Would you please place your materials before the court? I opened the first storage box, not with anger, but with care. The first item I placed on the table was a worn, faded notebook with pages stained by years of dust and rain. This was my daily project journal. I kept one for every phase of the restoration. Margaret opened it carefully. Every page contained handwritten notes, dates, measurements, weather conditions, material deliveries, and inspection schedules. These were simply the records of someone doing her job every day for 8 years. I placed down another notebook, then another, each one covering a different stage of the restoration, from foundation work to roof stabilization. The judge quietly examined several pages. Margaret said nothing. The notebooks spoke for themselves. Then I reached into the second box and pulled out a leather portfolio that belonged to my father. I opened it slowly, revealing the original concept sketches drawn with his old carpenter's pencil. My father had sketched possibilities, and I had turned them into reality. Margaret handed the drawings to the judge. This is the original restoration concept prepared before the property was purchased, and the implementation notes correspond directly to these drawings. No one argued. The evidence fit together naturally. Finally, I lifted a thick envelope from the bottom of the box, containing hundreds of photographs. These weren't promotional pictures. They showed construction crews pouring foundations, volunteers clearing debris, and engineers measuring damaged beams. And in nearly every stage, I was there, sometimes covered in dust, sometimes soaked by rain, balancing on scaffolding or reviewing blueprints with contractors. Margaret selected several photographs and handed them to the court one at a time. Each picture matched the notebooks, each notebook matched the permits, and each permit matched the contracts. Every document confirmed every other document. Together, they formed something impossible to ignore. I looked toward Ryan. He wasn't staring at me, he was looking at the photographs. His expression had changed to pure confusion. It was the face of someone seeing a version of history he had never been shown. For years, he had heard one story repeated enough times that it became truth in his mind. Now another story sat on the courtroom table, supported by thousands of pages, hundreds of photographs, and 8 years of careful records. The courtroom remained completely silent. Sometimes the strongest truth isn't the loudest one. It simply waits until every excuse has run out. The courtroom remained silent for several long seconds after the last photograph was placed on the evidence table. No one rushed to speak, and no one needed to. The documents had done what arguments never could. They told a complete story. Margaret quietly returned to her seat beside me. She didn't smile or celebrate. She simply folded her hands and waited. Across the room, Ryan stared at the stacks of records that covered the table between us. For the first time since all of this had started, he looked uncertain. The judge spent several minutes reviewing the exhibits, one notebook, another notebook, construction permits, engineering approvals, material invoices, inspection reports, and original sketches. Every page carried dates, signatures, and professional stamps, and one name appeared over and over again: Claire Bennett. My name, not because I wanted recognition, but because I had been the one responsible. Eventually, the judge looked toward Ryan's attorney. Would your client like to respond? The attorney leaned toward Ryan and whispered something I couldn't hear. Ryan didn't answer. He kept staring at the evidence. The attorney whispered again. Finally, Ryan stood. At first, his voice sounded calm. My father loved that place. He devoted his life to it. He spent years there. Then, suddenly, the frustration that had been building inside him finally surfaced. My father gave everything he had to that building. The words echoed through the quiet courtroom. For a brief moment, it felt as though Ryan wasn't speaking to the judge. He was speaking to himself. Margaret remained seated. She didn't object or argue. She simply looked at me, asking without words whether I wanted to respond. I stood slowly. I wasn't angry anymore. Somewhere during the hearing, my anger had quietly disappeared, replaced with sadness. Not only for Thomas, but for Ryan, too. I looked directly at him. You're right. Your father did give years of his life to that place. He believed in the Arts Center. He raised money for it, invited people into it, and defended it whenever someone questioned whether it was worth saving. Your father loved that building. Ryan nodded almost instinctively. Yes, he did. I took a slow breath. But loving a place isn't the same as building it. No one moved. No one spoke. I continued in the same calm voice. Thomas spent years inside those walls. I spent years rebuilding those walls. The difference hung quietly in the air. I wasn't trying to diminish Thomas. I was protecting the truth. I looked back at Ryan. Your father gave that place his heart. My company gave it its foundation. I gave it my mornings, my evenings, my weekends, my savings, my career, and my future. None of those sentences sounded dramatic while I was saying them. They were simply facts. Ryan shook his head, his voice softer now. No. No. He pointed toward the evidence table. My father. He stopped, unable to finish his own sentence. Margaret quietly walked to the table. She picked up a handful of the construction permits, contracts, and engineering approvals, and handed them one by one to Ryan's attorney, who passed them to Ryan. Ryan accepted the documents almost absent-mindedly, reading page after page. I watched his eyes move across every signature, every approval, and every official record. Every single document carried the same project owner, Claire Bennett Restoration. Every permit listed me, every contract listed my company, and every inspection report identified me as the responsible project manager. Ryan turned another page, then another. It was almost painful to watch. His breathing slowed, his shoulders lowered, and his certainty disappeared one document at a time. He wasn't discovering new evidence, he was discovering an entirely different version of his own family history. I remembered something Thomas had written in his letter. Every time Ryan failed, I convinced myself this would be the last time I needed to help him. Until that moment, I had understood those words only as a father's confession. Now I understood something else. Thomas hadn't only protected Ryan from financial consequences, he had protected him from uncomfortable truths. Ryan had grown up hearing stories about the Walker family legacy and his father's sacrifices. No one had ever stopped to explain where those stories ended and where mine began. Ryan lifted another photograph, showing me standing on scaffolding beside Sam during the winter roof repairs. He stared at it for several seconds before looking at the next ones, me reviewing blueprints with city inspectors, and me standing beside volunteers during the first community cleanup. I wasn't hidden in the background or visiting the project. I was leading it, every stage, every year. Finally, Ryan looked up at me. There was no anger left in his face, only confusion. He stopped again, then, almost quietly, he asked, "Why didn't anyone ever tell me?" It wasn't an accusation. It sounded like a child asking a question years too late. I thought about answering. I thought about telling him that people had tried, that newspapers had printed my name, and that the records had always existed. Instead, I found myself thinking about Thomas, and about every moment silence seemed easier than honesty. I answered as gently as I could. Because sometimes people believe they're protecting someone when they're really protecting a lie. Ryan lowered his eyes and the courtroom became quiet once again. A different silence this time, the kind that arrives when the truth finally reaches someone who has spent years believing something else. No one celebrated or applauded. There was nothing satisfying about watching another human being realize that much of what he believed about his own past had never been true. In that moment, Ryan didn't lose the argument. He lost the story he had been living inside, and somehow, I think that hurt him far more than losing any building ever could. The judge did not announce the decision that afternoon. Margaret had prepared me for that, explaining that probate matters involving property claims required additional time even when the evidence appeared overwhelming. So I went home and I waited. Waiting turned out to be harder than the hearing itself. At home, every hour felt longer than the one before it. I tried to focus on work, reviewing restoration proposals and returning phone calls from contractors asking whether the expansion project would move forward. Every conversation ended with the same answer: I don't know yet. For someone who had spent an entire career solving problems, those four words felt unbearable. 3 days later, Margaret called again. This time, I recognized the relief in her voice. The court has issued its ruling, Claire. The petition has been denied. The court found no legal basis to treat the art center as part of Thomas Walker's estate. The words settled over me slowly. The court recognized the uninterrupted chain of ownership, the purchase records, the restoration contracts, and the permits. Control of the property would immediately return to me. The temporary cloud over the title was lifted, and the suspended bank loan could move forward again. Legally, the fight was over. Margaret paused. "Congratulations, Claire." I thanked her and hung up. I expected to feel victorious, but instead I just sat there quietly, looking out the window. A legal decision can settle ownership, but it cannot instantly repair trust. It didn't erase Thomas's silence, and it didn't change the fact that people had believed someone else's version of my life for years. Later that afternoon, I drove back to the art center. This time, my access card worked. The small green light flashed and the door unlocked with that familiar click. I stood there for several seconds without moving. The building looked exactly the same. The lobby still smelled faintly of old wood and fresh coffee, and music drifted from an upstairs rehearsal room. As I walked through the galleries, several employees stopped what they were doing. Emily hugged me before saying a single word. Sam shook my hand so hard it almost hurt, and volunteers welcomed me back. Their kindness meant more than they realized, but winning a case still wasn't the same as reclaiming a story. A few mornings later, I unfolded the local newspaper that had just arrived on my porch. I almost skipped past the front page until I saw the headline. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It didn't mention a property dispute or a lawsuit. Instead, across the top of the page, I read, "The woman who quietly preserved our town's cultural landmark finally receives the recognition she earned." I read the entire article. The reporter told the story that should have been told years earlier. She described the abandoned estate I had purchased when no one else wanted it, interviewed contractors who remembered working beside me long after sunset, and quoted volunteers who recalled seeing me climb scaffolding before dawn. Sam shared the story of the freezing winter night we spent saving the roof. Emily described the evenings I stayed late to review blueprints, and David Morales explained why he had trusted the project from the very beginning. For the first time, my work wasn't hidden behind someone else's name. It stood on its own. Over the next few days, something unexpected began happening around town. People started correcting themselves. I'd overhear someone say, "I'll meet you at the Bennett Art Center," or "The concert is at Bennett Art Center Friday night." For years, most people had simply called it the Walker Estate. Little by little, I started hearing more people use its proper name. Not everyone did, but enough of them that I knew something had begun to change. Standing outside the front entrance one evening, I looked up at the sign. Buildings carry names, but names carry history.
Sometimes justice isn't loud, sometimes it arrives in a courtroom, and sometimes it arrives the first time an entire community finally calls something by its rightful name. That was the day I realized I hadn't simply regained control of a building, I had finally regained my own place in its history.
People often ask me what happened after the court ruled in my favor. They usually expect me to tell them I celebrated, or that I sold the art center, or that I found some way to make Ryan feel the same pain he had caused me. The truth is, none of those things happened, because somewhere along the way, I realized winning isn't the same as healing. A court can restore your rights, but it cannot decide what kind of person you become afterward. A few weeks after the case ended, several developers contacted me with generous offers to buy the property. The building had become more valuable than ever, and selling it would have been the easiest decision of my life. One evening, I actually considered it. I walked through the empty galleries after everyone had gone home, touching the restored stone walls that Sam and I had fought to save. Every room held a memory: children learning to paint, veterans sharing stories, families celebrating. Selling the building would have closed one chapter, but it also would have ended something much larger than my own story. So I declined every offer. Instead, I asked myself a different question. If this place had already preserved the past, how could it help build the future? That question became the beginning of a free apprenticeship program for young adults interested in historic preservation. Students wouldn't simply learn construction, they would learn everything my father had once taught me. The first day of class arrived on a bright autumn morning. Before the orientation officially began, I carried one small object into the main hall: my father's old carpenter's pencil. I placed it inside a simple glass display case near the entrance. On the plaque beneath it, I asked the engraver to write only one sentence: "No one can sign their name to work they never created." No explanation, no mention of lawsuits. Those who understood the story would recognize its meaning. About halfway through the opening ceremony, I noticed someone standing near the back of the room. It was Ryan. He'd entered quietly, but the confidence that had once filled every room he entered was gone, replaced by humility. He waited until the ceremony ended before walking toward me. I wasn't sure if I should come. His voice was hesitant. "I don't want the building, Claire. I don't want money either." He paused, looking toward the display case. "Would it be possible to see the original drawings?" Not to keep them, not to challenge them, simply to see them. I walked into my office and carried the worn leather portfolio back into the room. Ryan accepted it carefully, opening the first page with both hands. He didn't rush. He studied every pencil line and every handwritten note. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. There was nothing left that words could improve. When he finally closed the portfolio, he handed it back. "Thank you," he said quietly. I nodded, and that was all. There was no dramatic apology or emotional embrace. Some wounds don't disappear because you exchange the right words, but cycles can end. That moment wasn't forgiveness. It was the decision not to pass another generation the same false story. A week later, our apprentices began their first restoration project on an abandoned elementary school. Standing beside them, I demonstrated how to measure an uneven foundation. One young woman stopped and smiled. "I've never looked at an old building this way before." I smiled back. "That's because you're not looking at a building, you're looking at someone's memories." As the afternoon sun settled across the old schoolyard, pencils moved across paper, and new ideas took shape. My father's pencil had become too worn to draw another blueprint, but its purpose hadn't ended. It had simply inspired new hands to continue the work. Looking around at those students, I finally understood what I had truly regained. Not a building, not a lawsuit, not even my reputation. I had regained the freedom to live according to the values that built that place in the first place. Justice had restored my name. The community had restored my honor. But choosing compassion over revenge, that restored my future. And in the end, I think that's the strongest foundation anyone can ever build.